Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive with us.
Yes.
And today we're going back to the Gilded Age
Okay.
to explore the life and presidency of Grover Cleveland.
All right.
Now he's a really unique president,
Yes.
right? The only one to serve two non-consecutive terms,
Correct. 22nd and the 24th.
the 22nd and 24th. But we're
Yeah.
not just doing the typical,
No.
history highlights here.
No. We've got some really interesting sources today.
Yeah.
We're going to be hearing directly from Grover Cleveland's grandson,
But wow.
George Cleveland, through excerpts from a recent podcast interview.
Okay.
And then to give us that big picture historical context,
Yeah.
we've got insights from a Professor Mark Summers,
Okay.
who is really a leading expert on the 1884 election.
So we've got family stories. We've got expert analysis.
Right.
This is going to be a really fun way to get to know this president, who I think
Yeah.
is really often overlooked.
He is.
What I find so intriguing about him is, he was known for honesty, but he had to navigate one of the dirtiest elections in American history.
Absolutely.
And so I'm really wondering, did that integrity help him or hinder him
Right. That's really
during his second
a
term?
question, isn't it? And I think to really understand his path, we need to sort of grasp
Yeah.
how unusual his rise to power was.
Yeah. And George Cleveland mentioned
Yeah.
that his grandfather was not, born with a silver spoon.
Not at all.
His father was a minister.
Yeah.
Money was often tight.
Right.
In fact, Grover had to leave school to help support his family when his father died,
That's right.
which is not the typical origin story
Not the typical presidential origin story.
for president.
No. And yet he goes from being a lawyer in Buffalo to the White House
Yeah,
in a remarkably short time.
Right.
I mean, that alone speaks volumes
it really does.
about his ambition and his drive.
And it sounds like he really loved hard work.
He did.
George Cleveland even used the phrase like he loved dirty work
Yeah.
when describing his grandfather.
Yeah.
And, he wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, literally, when he was sheriff of Erie County.
Of course.
I can't imagine that was a glamorous job
No,
back then.
not at all. But it
Right.
really illustrates, I think, a key aspect of his character.
Yeah.
He, tackled those difficult tasks head on. He wasn't afraid of a challenge.
Yes.
And that combined with this reputation for honesty,
Yeah.
I mean, it really propelled him through the ranks of local politics.
Mhm.
Sheriff, mayor of Buffalo, then governor of New York.
I mean, that is a
It's a
really fast climb.
quite an incredibly fast climb.
Yeah. Did his reputation for honesty play like a specific role in his political success?
Oh, it was crucial, especially during that era.
Yeah.
Remember this was the height of the spoils system,
Right.
where political appointments were often based on favors and connections
Right.
rather than merit.
Yeah.
And Cleveland was seen as a reformer,
Yeah.
someone who would prioritize competence and integrity over
Mhm.
cronyism.
Okay, so that sets the stage for this 1884 election.
Right.
Which, from what I've read, was just an absolute mudslinging fest.
It really was.
Yeah.
One of the nastiest campaigns in American history.
Wow.
And we have to remember, this is the age of the partisan press.
Right.
These newspapers are openly aligned
Okay.
with political parties and often printing, sensationalized stories and
Right.
outright attacks on their opponents.
And he's facing off against James G. Blaine,
Yeah,
who's a Republican who has his own share of scandals.
right.
But the press doesn't spare Cleveland either.
No,
They bring up this love child scandal
right.
involving Maria Halpin.
Exactly.
I mean, this was front page news.
It was. And this was right as the American media was exploding in its reach and influence.
Yeah.
George Cleveland actually drew a parallel to today's paparazzi culture,
Pictures of.
saying that his grandparents were hounded
Wow.
relentlessly by the press, much like celebrities are today.
Some things never change, right?
I guess not. So how did Cleveland, who was a man known for his honesty,
Right.
handle this very public scandal?
Well, he did something quite unexpected.
Okay.
Instead of denying it or trying to spin the story,
Yeah.
he chose to be upfront.
Wow.
He acknowledged his past relationship with Maria Halpin,
Okay.
and he confirmed that he was providing financial support for her child.
I mean, that is incredibly bold for the time,
It was.
especially, given the moral climate back then.
Absolutely.
It seems almost counterintuitive
Right.
to admit to something scandalous to bolster your reputation for honesty.
It's a fascinating strategy.
Yeah.
But it seems to have worked in his favor.
Okay.
The Democrats very cleverly contrasted
Okay.
Cleveland's honesty with Blaine's evasiveness
Yeah.
regarding his own scandals.
Yeah.
You see, by trying to hide or downplay his past,
Yeah.
Blaine kind of inadvertently made himself look less trustworthy.
So in a way, Cleveland's commitment to honesty, even when it involved admitting to personal failings,
Was a key factor in his victory.
it was a pivotal element.
Okay.
His willingness to confront difficult truths resonated with voters who were tired of political maneuvering and deception.
Absolutely.
He did win by a very narrow margin.
Really?
It all came down to a few thousand votes in New York, his home state.
That must have been a nail-biter of an election night.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, his victory marked the first time a Democrat had been in the White House since before the Civil War.
Right.
I mean, this is a major turning point.
It is a major
Backdrop.
complete.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And with it came this wave of hope for honest government and much-needed reforms.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay.
It was a big deal.
All right.
Yeah.
So we left off with Grover Cleveland entering the White House, as a reformer, this reputation for honesty.
Right.
A Democrat in a world that's still largely shaped by the aftermath of the Civil War.
Absolutely.
What kind of changes did he bring to Washington?
Well, he was certainly a fiscal conservative at heart.
Professor Summers highlighted Cleveland's deep skepticism
Yeah.
about government spending.
Yeah.
He was famous for meticulously scrutinizing every single bill
Why?
that crossed his desk.
Right.
And he vetoed quite a few,
Reese.
even those from his own party,
Wow.
which earned him the nickname the veto president.
That lines with his famous quote that George Cleveland mentioned.
Yes.
While the people should support the government should not support the people.
Yeah.
That's a pretty bold statement
It is a bold statement.
for any president.
Especially one coming after a period of such upheaval and change.
Exactly, yeah.
It really highlights how his view of government differed from many in his own party.
Yeah.
He truly believed in limited government intervention,
Oh.
which, might sound more aligned with modern Republicans, but
Right, but back then.
back then it was a more complex picture.
Okay.
Take civil service reform, for example.
Yep.
Cleveland was a staunch advocate for ensuring that government jobs were awarded based on merit,
Oh,
not
yeah.
political favors.
I imagine that was a pretty controversial stance back then.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Challenging the spoil system was a risky move,
Yeah.
but it shows how Cleveland's commitment to honesty played out in his policies.
Okay.
He wasn't afraid to ruffle feathers within his own party
Yeah.
if it meant upholding his principles.
So it wasn't just talk.
No,
He put his ideals into action,
he did.
even if it meant making enemies along the way.
Right.
Were there any other examples of him taking on these powerful interests?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
One notable instance involved railroad companies
Oh.
during westward expansion.
Yeah.
Railroads had received these massive land grants from the
Yeah.
government with the understanding they would build tracks, connect the country.
Yeah.
However, many of these companies weren't fulfilling their end of the bargain.
Oh.
Cleveland made it a priority to reclaim those unused land grants, arguing that they rightfully belonged to the American people.
So he's taking on some pretty powerful entities here.
Yeah, especially during the Gilded Age,
Yeah.
when big business often held significant sway
Yeah.
in government.
What was the reaction to that?
Predictably, there was pushback from those who benefited from the status quo,
Yeah.
but Cleveland remained steadfast
No.
in his belief that the government should act
Yeah.
in the best interests of the people,
Okay.
even if it meant confronting powerful corporations.
So this commitment to what he saw as the public good,
Right.
it wasn't limited to just economic matters.
No, it's interesting to see how his views on conservation
Right.
stand out, particularly given the prevailing attitudes of the time.
Yeah. Professor Summers pointed out that Cleveland was a strong supporter
Yes,
of protecting natural resources,
as he was.
even creating the foundation for the state park system in New York.
That's right.
That seems a bit ahead of its time.
It was a different era, for sure.
Yet, weren't most people focused on exploiting resources for economic gain?
Many were.
Okay,
But
okay.
Cleveland understood the value of preserving these areas for future generations.
Okay.
He saw this rapid industrialization happening all around him,
Right.
and recognized the need to balance economic progress with environmental stewardship.
It's a concept that seems obvious now,
It does.
but back then that was pretty forward thinking.
Quite forward thinking.
So he was a fiscal conservative,
Right.
a reformer, and an early conservationist.
Yep.
Quite a mix of seemingly contradictory ideologies.
It is.
It sounds like he was constantly trying to find a balance.
He was navigating a very complicated landscape,
Yeah.
trying to adhere to his principles,
Right.
while also responding to the needs of a rapidly changing nation.
And amidst all this serious governing,
Right.
Cleveland's personal life takes an unexpected turn.
Yes, it does.
Remember, he entered the White House as a bachelor,
Right?
which was unusual for a president.
Yeah.
And then midterm, he marries Frances Folsom
Right.
in a White House ceremony.
I mean, it was a huge event, wasn't it?
It was a media sensation.
Yeah.
Frances was young, beautiful.
Okay.
She instantly captivated the public.
Yeah.
Newspapers couldn't get enough of her,
Wow.
publishing her pictures, speculating about every detail of her life.
Right.
George Cleveland even mentioned how
Yeah.
some newspapers made these outlandish claims about her beauty regimen,
Wow.
which sounds a lot like the tabloid culture we see today.
It's fascinating how quickly she became a celebrity,
She did.
a fashion icon.
Yeah.
I guess the public's fascination with the First Lady
What
goes
God
way back.
certainly does. And this intense focus on Frances actually marked a turning point in the role of the First Lady.
Oh, wait.
Before her, it was a much more
Yeah.
private, ceremonial position.
Okay.
But Frances, with her youth and charisma,
Right.
brought this whole new level of public attention on the
Interesting.
role. So in a way, she inadvertently helped shape the modern perception
You could say that.
of the First Lady
I
as a public figure,
think so.
a trend that continues to this day.
Absolutely.
But back to Cleveland's presidency.
Right.
After a relatively smooth first term and this highly publicized wedding,
Right.
things were about to get a lot more turbulent.
That's right. His second term was overshadowed by the Panic of 1893,
Okay.
a severe economic depression that would test his leadership and principles
Okay.
in unprecedented ways.
So we left off with Grover Cleveland starting his second term. And, just as this massive economic crisis hits the United States,
Right. The Panic of 1893.
the Panic of 1893, I mean, this wasn't just, a dip in the market.
Yeah.
We're talking widespread bank failure.
Yes.
Businesses collapsing, unemployment skyrocketing.
For millions of Americans.
So this is a huge challenge
Absolutely.
to Cleveland's core beliefs about the role of government.
Right. Here he was,
Yeah.
this staunch fiscal conservative, facing a crisis that many believed demanded
Right.
aggressive government action.
So how did he respond?
Well, did
he stick to his small government principles,
he did.
even in the face of such widespread suffering?
To a large extent. And that's where his commitment to honesty,
Yeah.
which had served him so well up to this point,
Right.
became a real point of contention.
Okay.
Professor Summers argued that Cleveland's almost rigid adherence
Okay.
to the gold standard, this belief that paper money must be backed by gold reserves,
Okay.
actually worsened the Depression.
So this was a time when many people were calling for increased government spending
Right.
to stimulate the economy.
Exactly. And Cleveland saw that as
Yeah.
fiscally irresponsible.
So it's this real clash of ideologies.
It is.
Right? The need to address the immediate suffering, but also his long-term economic principles.
Absolutely.
How did his decisions play out politically?
Not well. He vetoed several bills aimed at providing relief, and the Democrats ended up losing control of Congress. Wow.
In a landslide in 1894.
It makes you wonder if he had any regrets about it later.
It's hard to know for sure,
Yeah.
but it's worth noting that he never publicly wavered
Okay.
from his belief that he did what he thought was right
Yeah.
for the long-term health of the
We're doing
nation.
a little long term.
But there's another layer to the story
Right.
that I think adds even more complexity to his second term.
You're talking about the secret surgery?
The secret surgery, yes.
The fact that he had a cancerous tumor removed from his jaw
In the middle of all this turmoil.
in the middle of all this.
It was done on a friend's yacht
Wow.
under the guise of a fishing trip.
Okay.
The public had absolutely no idea that their president was battling cancer
Yeah.
while simultaneously grappling with this economic crisis.
And get this, they replaced part of his jaw with a piece of vulcanized rubber.
I know George Cleveland even joked about a family rumor
Yeah.
that the rubber piece was stashed away somewhere in his uncle's house.
Imagine finding that in your attic. It's a rather bizarre footnote to history.
Yeah.
But it also humanizes Cleveland.
Right.
It shows us that behind this, gruff exterior
Yes.
reputation for seriousness,
Yeah.
he was facing these incredibly difficult personal challenges.
Yeah.
Yet he never shirked his duty.
It's a real testament to his resilience
It is.
and dedication.
Absolutely.
So looking back at his two terms,
Yeah.
his tumultuous second term, especially, how is Grover Cleveland remembered?
Well, despite the challenges of a second term,
Yeah.
he's largely viewed as a man of principle and integrity.
Okay.
Professor Summers quoted his dying words, "I've tried so hard to do right."
Wow.
It's simple, but it's a powerful statement
It is.
that reveals a lot about his character and
Yeah.
his motivations.
He wasn't perfect.
No,
He made some controversial decisions,
of course.
but he was driven by this genuine desire to serve the public good,
He was.
even when it meant making unpopular choices.
Absolutely.
It makes you wonder if modern presidents could learn something from Cleveland's commitment to honesty
It's a fascinating question.
and his willingness to stand up for what he believed in.
Is it possible to be both an honest person
Right.
and an effective leader in today's political climate?
What compromises are necessary?
Where do we draw the line?
There are no easy answers,
No.
but I think exploring the life of someone like Grover Cleveland,
Right.
with all his complexities and contradictions,
Yeah.
can help us grapple with these questions in a more nuanced way.
I think so.
He reminds us that even the most well-intentioned leaders can make mistakes,
They can.
and that navigating complex challenges
Right.
often requires tough choices, and maybe even a bit of compromise.
Bit of compromise.
Yeah, and perhaps most importantly, he shows us that integrity and honesty,
Yes.
while not always sufficient on their own,
Right.
are still essential qualities for anyone who aspires to lead.
Well said.
So for those who are, intrigued by this Gilded Age president, I highly recommend checking out the Society of Presidential Descendants website.
It's a great resource.
They have a wealth of information about presidential families and their impact on history.
For anyone looking to dive deeper.
Yeah, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the life and times of Grover Cleveland.
My pleasure.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.